Welcome to our Society of Labour Lawyers webinar. I'm Catherine Atkinson, I'm the Secretary of the Society, and this is our 9th and final webinar, at least in our current weekly series. We will be continuing, but on a monthly basis. So for our last one, we wanted to do something a little different. This evening, we have an in conversation with David Lammy MP for Tottenham, our Shadow Secretary of State for Justice and Shadow Lord Chancellor, and as of this week, an Associate Tenant at Doughty Street Chambers as well. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much. It's great to join you guys, all of us at home.
We're very pleased to have you. Now, there will be an opportunity for participants to ask questions of David yourselves. Just put your hand up digitally and we'll switch on your camera and microphone so you can ask your question. But for the first part of the webinar, I'm taking chair's prerogative and have a few questions for David myself. Now, we will get on to law, but before we do, I wanted to ask you about how the killing of George Floyd has impacted on you. This evening, we saw people across the UK take the knee in solidarity with protesters in response to the killing of George Floyd by police officers in Minneapolis. And that's why our webinar was slightly delayed. As a teenager, you and your 4 siblings who were raised by your mother in Tottenham, and I've heard you describe being stopped and searched by police before you were even a teenager. What do you say to young people today about the progress that we've seen since your youth and what urgently needs to change?
Well, thank you very much. Look, the starting point for me is actually to go back to those slightly later teenage years, and just because it's this particular audience, and I feel a sort of warm glow with the Society of Labour Lawyers, to say that my motivation to get into law in the first place was very much inspired by growing up in Tottenham and growing up in a period of huge controversy in our own country. This was an era of the Birmingham 6, the Guildford 4, the Tottenham 3, huge controversy about miscarriages of justice, and great lawyers like Mike Mansfield and Helena Kennedy and others really leading the way in challenging that. It was also a period, of course, that where I came of age, where we had rioting in Tottenham, which led to the death of PC Keith Blakelock, in Brixton, in Handsworth, in St Paul's, in Brixton, in Leeds. And it really marked the era of a fight for civil rights post the period in which we had, at least in theory, established equality in the law following the legislation of Roy Jenkins. But that wasn't in practice. And so that's what birthed my interest in law and what makes this moment, in one sense, deeply, deeply depressing. The brutality that is being met on African-American men and women in the United States shakes me to my soul. But it makes, of course, a lot of us incredibly weary and tired that yet again we see this played out. I think it's important to say that it takes on a particular feature at this moment, this global moment, because, of course, Donald Trump is leading the United States of America, and he's determined to lead it in a populist nationalist way. He's determined, I suspect, to arouse sympathies amongst white supremacists in his own country that might keep him in office in November. So depressingly, I sit here worried, frankly, about the prospects for this subject over the next few months up to November. But I would want to remind this audience that, you know, these problems aren't unique to the United States. We can't save our anger for the United States. We know that over here, you're 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched just in this corona period. And we've looked at who the fines have gone to. You look at the disproportionality in Black, Asian and minority ethnic individuals being fined. We know that we have had also our own cases of tragic deaths in police custody. Now, we don't have the guns that the United States has, and at least because of lobbying, we have an independent police complaints mechanism particularly. So, but it is to say that those issues are very significant, and of course, it affects and touches me. The hope, I think, comes in the form of the millennial Generation Y, who I just don't think will tolerate this. And there's a whole range of issues, including climate change and others, where I do think that once they have the levers of power, we will see genuine change. But I'm afraid we are some way off that. And so we're into a very, very bumpy period. And I think in this era of fear probably exacerbated by the coronavirus, and then the likely recession, depression that's likely to follow, clearly in relation to othering, finding reasons to challenge and suppress and create victims in relation to minorities, that is a very, very real threat. And that sort of motivates and animates me, both politically, legally, and I might say too that, you know, just one last thing. I mean, you know, I could speak for quite a long time.
We're hoping so, about an hour, in fact.
Is that anyone who saw the Conservative manifesto will also have seen that they plan to come forward with changes to judicial review. It's not clear at all that human rights is fully protected. We have an Attorney General that thinks it's correct to use that office to legitimise the breaking of rules and laws, as we saw last week with Dominic Cummings. So this is a period where some of the tactics that we have seen in the Trump administration, that we're seeing in different parts of the world, whether it's in parts of Europe, in Brazil and other places, seem to be being deployed here. And I think it's an era in which you would expect this group, this society of Labour lawyers, progressive lawyers, to be vigilant and to be absolutely on watch for what is happening.
Absolutely. Now, you've talked a bit about what originally motivated you towards pursuing a career in the law. You studied at SOAS and studied law at SOAS, and was the first Black Briton to attend Harvard Law School, called to the bar, as well as being an attorney in the US. So that was, you talked about your motivation then. I'm interested, you particularly asked for this role in Cabinet, in Justice, from Keir Starmer, didn't you? Why in particular did you want to take on being the Shadow Secretary of State for Justice?
I'm not sure I'm allowed to gossip about the conversations that I've had with Keir Starmer. Safe to say that I was very pleased when he offered me this role, and you know, didn't send me to, I don't know, I'm not going to actually
be careful now.
I don't know if I'd have been the best Secretary of State for Agriculture. But I suppose the reason that that this was important to me, that this brief was important to me, was one, because to some extent there is a forward-looking manifesto in the shape of the review that I did into the disproportionality of Black, Asian and minority ethnic people in our criminal justice system. And of course, Keir was one of my advisors on that review. And I say that not just, but I can get into the detail of that, the particularity of the disproportionality, but a lot of the areas that I looked at in that review, I think wider than just the context of race, and require a Labour government to be in the business of reform. So let me pick some of those out. I'm very concerned about women in prison. I think that we need to pick up the baton that Jean Corsten's review left us a few years ago. I'm still yet to meet a woman who is not in prison because of a man who has abused her, who has pimped her. And obviously the consequences of putting a woman in prison is often that her children are going to end up in care or in the criminal justice system themselves. So can we reduce the amount of women in our system? And I was obviously very concerned with minority women in prison, but nevertheless, the broader issue of women in prison, I think, ought to be a Labour ambition. I think that I'm concerned about the youth justice system. Colleagues will know that obviously over the last 20 years in frontline politics, I've had a lot to say about issues like gang crime, knife crime, the sorts of things that concern us greatly in terms of serious violence amongst young people, and the consequences of that violence and the causes of that violence. But I think our youth justice system, which was reformed under Tony Blair with the desire to reduce the amount of young people in prison, has succeeded, obviously, to some extent in doing that. But we do also know that currently 51% of those in our youth offenders institutions are from a black or minority ethnic background. It's not always the case, I say this gently, that youth criminal justice issues attract the most senior lawyers. It's certainly the case that young people, in terms of county lines, trafficking of serious amounts of drugs, murder in relation to knife crime and gang activity, are really, we're talking about very, very serious crimes and require, I think, a look again at that system. I think in our magistrates' courts, magistrates are at a very low ebb, very low morale. The cuts mean that actually that sense of locality, is very distant from communities. I mean, Tottenham isn't that far from Highbury magistrates, but somehow it's very far from Highbury magistrates. And so there's something there in terms of our magistrate as well. I've raised concerns about the diversity of our judiciary. And I'm very concerned about the criminal records regime, which I think too often condemns young adults who are into their 20s, late 20s, wanting to reform, wanting to move on. And actually, because of this sort of punitive regime that's one of the toughest in the world, in which you have to declare your record, you're perennially pulled back into a life of crime. Yeah. I'm broadly of the view that we have to be serious about rehabilitation. And of course, since the Grayling reforms to probation, rehabilitation in the community is in an absolute shambles. And you can't be serious, which I'm sure this community would want to see, in reforming prison, recognizing that back in 1995, we had about 45,000 people in prison. Now we've got well over 80,000 people in prison. You can't be serious about rehabilitation and reform unless you have a successful probation regime. So that was a forward agenda that I set out in the review. And obviously I'm keen to get on with the business of doing that. And alongside that, questioning and challenging the government where they need to on areas like human rights, areas like judicial review, and currently with coronavirus, of course, the crisis and the backlog in our courts is huge. It was huge before we went in. It's going to be crisis time by the autumn. And very clearly, legal aid cuts has now cut this public service back to a bone. Some of you might recall the speech I made a few years ago in Parliament about legal aid. I feel very, very strongly that we have to remake the case for law as a public service. And as we head into a recession, with the figures that have been produced by the Criminal Bar Association and the Bar Council, and of course the Law Society and criminal solicitors, it's clear that we may well be seeing the decimation of that criminal fraternity, that criminal group of lawyers representing individuals. And that's notwithstanding concerns in family, concerns in housing, concerns in welfare, concerns in employment as well that are replicated.
Well, certainly legal aid and access to justice generally is a key priority for the society, and I'm sure you'll get many questions on it. Before we move away from the Lammy review, the independent review that you did into the treatment of BAME individuals in the criminal justice system, I wanted to just ask a further question about it, because you back then you had noted that the overrepresentation of BAME individuals in the prison system amounted to an extra 12 prisons worth. Arrest rates were higher across all BAME communities. BAME offenders were more likely to receive prison sentences and had higher rates of offending. And I thought really poignantly, you noted that the criminal justice system had a trust deficit with BAME communities. Now, there's been a response in February to the review, and I wanted to ask you how well you think the government has responded and what you think it's missed.
Well, I was keen to try and keep the cross-party consensus that was achieved when David Cameron asked me to do this work. And you can see with what's happening in the United States why I was keen to keep that cross-party consensus. But notwithstanding that, we just haven't made the progress. The numbers in terms of youth offenders has gone in the wrong direction. It's actually got worse since my review. There's been small progress in terms of recruitment into of staff in prisons, but in terms of access to employment, access to ROTL and release, access to education, access to therapy, all the stuff that means that those offenders might not end up recidivists, that hasn't really moved at all. Clearly there are still challenges in terms of, and this goes to the trust issue. The trust issue wasn't just about policing. We tend to focus a lot on policing, but the trust that I picked up was also about our courts. It was, you know, I'll never forget going up to Yorkshire and to Bradford and speaking to Asian communities up in Yorkshire, and their strong feeling that when they were in Crown Courts, that they were treated differently by, well, an arena that felt to them to be entirely white from judge and in terms of representation and in terms of jury. And so there is a trust deficit. Now that trust deficit, what you tend to find is that first generation immigrants, there isn't a trust deficit because they're arriving from countries where the legal system is questionable. And that's often the reason why they're leaving. But amongst that second generation, I mean, a trust just falls through the floor. And I don't think that's shifted very much. I'm not sure the department has done the work. So there's a lot to do on this agenda. And let me just say, because it's important to emphasize, when I looked at diversity, I wasn't just looking at the narrow group of Black individuals like me or Muslims in the criminal justice system, Asians. There are groups like, for example, gypsies and travellers who have been historically overrepresented in our criminal justice system, and no one has said anything about it. In fact, until my review, no one was even keeping the data. That has got better. They are now at least recording the figures as a result of my review, but there's a hell of a lot to do. And what we're seeing in the States reminds us that there's a lot to do. And some of the rhetoric, I think, that we see from Priti Patel, the response to the Windrush scandal that we're seeing from Suella Braverman, all of it suggests there's a tremendous amount in this area to do.
You touched on diversity in the professions, and in 2000 you were the youngest MP in Parliament at 27 years old, but both politics and the legal world still suffers from an overrepresentation of white men. How can we change that?
Well, look, we created the Judicial Appointments Commission. I moved on from the sort of tap on the shoulder. I have my question mark about whether that system has entirely worked. I think that there are still barriers for the employed bar. I think there are barriers for solicitors. There are barriers for areas like the Crown Prosecution Service, where actually lots of minority lawyers who ought to be able to make their way into the judiciary and are not. I think the progress is incredibly slow. The feedback loops are not sufficient and are not good enough. And I think, in a sense, you know, what chambers you're in and all that sort of stuff can still have a massive effect on who gets who gets the nod and who doesn't. So, I mean, I've got to be pretty honest about how I think the system works. This is not, of course, just in relation to ethnic diversity. It's also the case in relation to gender, which has moved on a bit and is slightly better, but given the nature of the profession, is not nearly where it should be. And one of the things that we don't do enough in this country is when you look at other common law jurisdictions, let's leave out for these purposes the United States because of the way that they recruit. But if you look at Canada, if you look at New Zealand, particularly, we're years and years and years behind where that diverse bunch at all levels of the judiciary, and not just constantly pointing to what's happening in the tribunals.
Now, we've already touched on access to justice and the rule of law are probably the key priorities for the Society of Labour Lawyers, and we have seen both trammelled by this government. You've mentioned briefly concerns around the response to COVID-19 and judicial review, but what would you say are the key challenges now that we should be focusing on?
Well, there's a key challenge around, clearly, the self-employed bar and those who rely on legal aid, and particularly junior barristers. I think there's a second challenge around how the legal aid agency has performed and its willingness to provide funds rapidly on the basis of last year's accounts and returns, and that's been incredibly slow. It does need, to some extent, a bespoke response from Rishi Sunak, and I've written to him in relation to that. Clearly, there are long-standing issues. LASPO has got to be repealed, but that awaits a Labour government, and we need a proper criminal legal aid review mechanism once again. Of course, I'm really worried, because in a sense, this conversation will now be against the backdrop of a massive downturn in the economy and the historic position that publicly funded work has found itself in, as against those making the case for education, as against those making the case for health, as against those making the case for areas like defence. But I do think clearly access to justice, and actually this is not just access to early advice, is also an important area, of course. It's going to be really important in this painful period ahead. You know, I see a lot of the mutual aid that's going on in my local area in Tottenham. There's a lot of hardship. The food banks are full. People are, yes, they've been furloughed, but many expect to be made redundant. Real pressures in housing anyway. It's likely to get considerably worse. We saw crime flatten, but now it's back on the spike. And you've seen, for some reason, these discrepancies in terms of ethnicity on fines and other areas where you bring in legislation, and we pass very quickly the Coronavirus Act, and you see governments granting huge sweeping powers to the state to control lives in the way that we've seen. We haven't yet even got onto the tracing app and how that's going to work. All of that requires quality, publicly funded legal system. And I will do my best, and you know, you'll be able to judge this, but I will do my best to bring my own advocacy skills to this area, and to be more persuasive, I think, in reaching the public as to why this is important. So one's not just making the case for lawyers, and some of you will have seen the article that I wrote. We've got to abandon this idea that there are any fat cat criminal aid lawyers, that just doesn't exist, and to dismantle some of these arguments.
Thank you. I'm going to have one final question before we open it up to others. Now that you are the Shadow Secretary, Justice Secretary, I wanted to find out a bit more about what you want to do with that role and after the next general election, what you will be doing as our Secretary of State for Justice.
Well, the next general election in 2024 will see Keir Starmer leading the country. And I think that it could be a really golden period of reform in areas that have long needed it. I hope that we will be able to change the context of prison. Rehabilitation and probation will be back in a very serious way. There is a real case for proper investment in our courts. Clearly, coming out of the coronavirus period, some will make the case that courts can now all be virtual. I don't accept that. I think there might be areas on the civil commercial side where innovation can be put to good use, but I very much still believe in the face-to-face principles in our criminal courts particularly. And so our court structure will need investment. We will need to get legal aid back on a good footing, and I hope to be able to do that. And I want it to be a progressive government that makes the sorts of changes in relation to my review, deep and lasting changes that feels like the sorts of changes that Roy Jenkins was able to make in the Home Office in relation to equality and giving the first set of rights in relation to racial discrimination back in that period in the late 60s, early 70s. So it's a big agenda of reform. It's an exciting agenda of reform, and I'm really excited to have the opportunity to do it. And of course, to work in partnership with Nick Thomas-Symonds, of course, who will also be there as Home Secretary.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, David. I'm now going to open it up to questions by others, and we'll take them in threes. If we can start...
I just ask, because I'm not the font of all wisdom, and the period has been defined for me to some extent largely by the coronavirus, that I am actually really keen just to hear the wisdom that's online. So it's not, I hope it's not just questions to me, but also observations and things that I might want to look at.
Absolutely. Well, considering we're a bunch of lawyers, generally, they're not shy from speaking. But we do hope and anticipate that this is really the start of an ongoing relationship, so that we can be of use to yourself and the shadow cabinet. But we are going to start with a question from Andrew Dismore.
Oh, good evening, David.
Hi.
If you're looking at judicial diversity, I would suggest that it's a good idea to look at the tribunal judiciary, because they're not perfect by any means, but far more diverse.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And part of the problem is the difficulty of trying to move from the tribunal judiciary into the court judiciary. It's still, although under the same part of the courts and tribunal service, it's still effectively two separate organisations. And I think that's a really good way, A, to get judicial experience, and B, then to use as a platform and move on. And I think that the recruitment process is actually pretty fair and pretty competitive, having gone through it twice now. And the other point I was just going to make on tribunals, because I'm sitting in the SEC now, talking about backlogs. Don't forget about the backlogs in the tribunal service, particularly in SEC, where you've got people already waiting months for their benefits. You've got a 70% plus success rate on appeals, and people are waiting a long, long time now for their money. And the backlog is just going to get worse and worse.
Thank you very much.
One last point. What do you think of the IOPC? Is it fit for purpose?
Deeba. Got a question from Deeba.
Hi, David Lammy. It's so good to have you here. Big fan. Don't want to fawn over you too much. I work with women, so I work for a legal rights charity, and we give free legal advice to women who have been sexually harassed in the workplace. And I'm afraid the situation with that, which again, what you were saying about race, diversity, and those statistics, there was hardly any statistics being gathered on this, and I'm afraid from my experience on the front line of this, actually the situation about sexual harassment is even worse than we imagined. A lot of those women are being sexually assaulted in the workplace, and a lot of the women are I deal with will have the choice but to go to the police and report these assaults. And I think we've got a real problem with the way that women interact with the justice system, not in prisons, but when they first go to the police, and a lack of understanding in the police about the way that trauma works, the way that sexual violence works, to do with, you know, myths around victim blaming, around the role of alcohol, and it's pervasive, and it is toxic, and it is really ruining women's lives when they have to go through this very traumatic experience of trying to explain to a policeman that you've been assaulted, and only to be sort of treated like you're the one on trial there. So that's a huge issue, and I think we need to do much more to educate the police about how this actually works. And I was just keen to sort of raise that so that you understand that it's the criminal justice system, of course, is not just interacting with the courts, but that first touch when they go to the police. You know, I find myself in a position where I'm saying to women, you know, take a lawyer with you, even though they're the victim, because the way that the police is going to treat them or mishandle their evidence or anything like that is becoming a really frustrating process for me. So that's more of a contribution I just wanted to put in there, but I think it's really important that we understand what it's actually like going through the criminal justice system from that perspective.
Thank you very much, Deeba. And finally, before we'll have a response, George Peretz QC.
Yeah, my question is, I hope it's a short one. What do you think is the best way of tackling the claim that judicial review of government decisions, especially on human rights grounds, but also on wider grounds like the Unison case on tribunal fees where decision regulations were overturned on the rule of law grounds? What do you think the best way of tackling the claim that those the decisions by judges are fundamentally undemocratic because they involve unelected judges overturning the decisions of elected politicians? Because that's the claim that's going to be made by the government in pushing through its attacks on judicial review.
A good range for you there, David.
Thank you, Andrew, for that observation on tribunals. You're completely right. I actually did see that evidence of that in my own review, and it's similar to the barriers that the employed bar face solicitors. The system's just too hierarchical and has a tendency to preference lawyers who've been to certain universities, frankly, and then have been to certain sets of chambers. So points very well made. I think it's a watching brief, by the way, on the IOPC. We've seen several incarnations of independence in relation to complaints in this area, and I'm still watching and seeing. I think I've made up my mind. Thank you, Deeba, for that. I've seen my own cases locally of women in this position. One comes to mind that's very recent, where the woman had a horrendous experience. It wasn't in London. She was my constituent, but the incident happened outside of London, and I was absolutely shocked at the lack of protocol and this treatment that she received when she reported this particular incidence of rape. And I obviously got in touch with the constabulary in that area and pressed the case quite hard. So I recognise what you've said, and look, I would hope that when we get out of this period, that alongside my concerns to do something about women in prison, that a real alliance can be forged with the women in the Parliamentary Labour Party, with great colleagues like Harriet Harman, who's a very dear friend and is obviously on the Human Rights Select Committee. I think we can do a lot in this area, and so I hope we can work together going forward. I think we've got to get back to the basics on judicial review. We have to explain, I have a responsibility here, of course, in layman's terms, why judicial review is so important to to members of the public. Why, if a local authority or indeed a government decide that they want to build a road through your house, your ability to take judicial review is fundamental. And why, whilst we of course preserve the fundamental of democracy and elected politicians who you can kick out, we also are very, very nervous, very, very weary of going in the direction of the United States, in which we have a politicized judiciary, and therefore we treasure the independence of our judiciary. But the challenge there is it's precisely why we must have a judiciary that doesn't feel remote, cut off, and not representative of different class groups and different racial groups. It's why I tend to stress that so greatly. And but clearly independence is fundamental, and we have to make that case. And I think that we can point to quite a lot in the United States that doesn't fit at all with public attitude to this. Can I just signal something? I'm very keen to do polling work and focus group work with the general public on how they feel about areas of within my brief. This has not been done for a considerable time. Let me give you some examples of this. Obviously, if you were coming from a progressive point of view, you would make the argument for rehabilitation and reducing the amount of people in prison. But you can also make that argument purely from an economic point of view, and the fact that we waste lots of money by sending people to prison. I'd like to test and know how the public feel about that language, how the public really feel about human rights, what sorts of things they raise, not just what they hear in some of the tabloid papers and from some parts of the Conservative Party. And I am definitely going to be looking for some of our lawyers to help fund some of this work over the coming months. And that will help, I think, when we come back to fighting the case, both for judicial review and against reform of judicial review, but also for legal aid, because we've got to get the language right and not allow our opponents to paint us into a box that would suggest that somehow this was just a concern for a liberal elite in London. It's not just a concern for a liberal elite in London. These are hard-won battles that have been fought and won, and we mustn't let the regressives roll them back.
Absolutely. We've got lots of hands up, so we're going to try and get through as many as we possibly can. I think we're going to be starting with Ruth Hughes.
Sally Hughes.
Hello.
Oh,
No,
Ruth.
thanks. Got two Hughes. Ruth to start.
Thank you. I just wanted to bring up an issue about open justice, which I know is something that David is interested in. And I wanted to share my experience, which is that I wanted to watch a judicial review application for permission to appeal today. And so I requested on the administrative court email address in the morning to get a link to view it, and I got essentially a response that said we will deal with this in the next 5 to 10 working days. Gave me a number to call, which I did call a number of times, which was simply unanswered. I'm very concerned that it's impossible for anyone to watch hearings that are happening in the administrative court unless you know the clerk of the judge who's taking the hearing, which the court, of course, will not give out on request.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ruth. Graham Anderson.
David, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and I apologise for my lockdown facial hair. I'm usually a bit more professional than this. I practice almost entirely in employment tribunal work and mostly discrimination stuff. Employment tribunals weren't glamorous places before the COVID crisis, but they're now suffering the double whammy of already having had a huge backlog. And of course, the COVID crisis is creating new employment disputes every day. I was supposed to be in a trial, a discrimination trial this week, which has now been relisted for the beginning of 2022. So you can see what a state they're in. How high a priority are employment tribunals going to be, unglamorous as they are, for us as a party? And what can we as a society do to assist the party in ensuring justice in the workplace? I asked that in my stead, sort of chairing the employment group for the society.
Thank you very much. Sally Hughes.
You can hear me. Okay. Okay. I put in a complicated specialist question that arises from the housing group. I don't really want to ask that now, although it's a good, well, I've been in, okay, sorry for this. You can see what an old lady I am. I worked for the Legal Action Group. I wasn't a lawyer to start with, just a quick biog. And I was on the executive of Labour Lawyers from 95 to 2005. When I was a lawyer, was a practicing lawyer. So I come at this from quite a different perspective, and I've a lot of my career invested in legal services and thinking about legal services. And I hear you, David, because I'm a huge fan of yours anyway, and I have a lot of hope invested in you. But what I do hear are rehashes of old arguments about the place of access to justice in the economy. The people who reformed legal aid in the 1930s and 40s actually were thinking differently about it, and we've lost that way of thinking. The reason I resigned from the Society of Labour Lawyers Executive in 2005 was because the Society and the Labour government wasn't really taking access to justice seriously. And we did get stuff coming out of the Labour Party, from the Labour Party talking about fat cats. What was actually happening was that the profession was already changing, because civil legal aid rates, for instance, what private independent practitioners were paid, have been frozen already for more than a decade. And you cannot operate a profession or even a service or anything that comes up beyond that, a reified thing, when you create such disparities in your professional workforce. And that was the era when corporatism took over a lot of the profession. And we can never get those people back without really serious spade work to retrain the profession, to re-equip it. The second thing I want to raise with you is you can look
if you can, because there's lots of people.
As quickly as I can, right. I hear you now talking once again, like politicians, lots of politicians before you, about the competition with education and housing and health, etc., as though they are the real deal. And law is a frill on the edges. It isn't. It's part of the economic mechanism. When you take power away, take the state's power away from litigants, doesn't matter where they are in the system, criminal or civil, you're putting a loaded gun in the hands of big business and big interests, and ultimately government itself. So that's really, I'm not so much asking you as having a kind of rant and saying some of these ideas need to be developed.
Thank you very much, Sally. David.
Well, Sally, thank you for that rant. It was a very good rant. What I wasn't conceding, I want to make it clear, I was not conceding the case in relation to other important public services. I don't like the competition. I was sharing with this group that I recognise that there's a massive advocacy role over this next period, and there is a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work to do about language and remaking that case. So, in that sense, I'm with you on that. I don't want to be too gloom laden, but clearly we've had a desperate period of austerity, and I bow to none in relation to my constituency in terms of seeing the effects of that austerity. We're now going to go into the most unbelievable global recession that may well be more of a depression. And so I think that the arguments that you make about the spade work, your question was going to be on housing. These are now critical areas because the need will be huge. it's unbelievable that we've got a Conservative government effectively being pushed into a place where I saw figures that over 50% of the population is now being paid for by the state, if you include that furlough. So this is a period in which we can remake and change genuinely, but it will be tough, because it will be tough economically. So I'm up for those arguments. We need to do a lot of thinking and a lot of policy development and work. But I think more than anything, we have to, this is a period of powerful advocacy that's going to be necessary. So I'm looking for help, and I found nothing in what you said that I didn't sort of agree with, really. Oh, you'll have to now remind me, because I got so carried away with that question, what the other questions were.
So before
employment tribunals.
We also had Ruth. We had Ruth as well.
And again, employment tribunals are fundamental. They're fundamental to our movement because of our partnership with trade unions. They're going to be fundamental in an era in which lots and lots of people are going to be dismissed from work unfairly. And there are going to be lots of areas where that has to be challenged, where individuals should rightly challenge. And I'm already seeing the emails in that context. And so I totally understand the importance of employment law, but also which may well be an area in which we see the government come forward with legislation, by the way, but also our tribunals in this period. And what was the other question?
It was about open justice. It was the inability to be able to watch.
Thank you for the point on open justice. You've seen in several of the things that I've written, that I've raised, the importance of open justice. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, and justice has to be seen, absolutely has to be seen. And there are too many stories of courts that apparently you can go to, but actually you can't, even socially distanced. The security won't let you in. Whilst we're celebrating virtual courts in different ways, they're actually not as accessible as they should be, and people can't get on and see them. And so what can happen in this period is great injustice. So I believe powerfully in open justice. And this is a period in which, if we are going to have courts virtual, then people have to be able to clock on and see it on the website. And I'll be pressing that point and continuing to press it, not just through this period, but beyond it.
Thank you. I'm conscious we've only got you for 10 more minutes, so I'm really sorry. So there's lots and lots of hands up. We're only going to take one more round of questions. And then, David, if you could, after answering the questions, give any closing remarks that you would like. So we are going to start with Stephen Cooke.
Two very quick things. One, we now have a crime group, and so just bear that in mind. Really, how can we help you? That's the first thing. Don't have to answer now, obviously, but as things occur, how can that group help? Second thing, I know something you've already spoken about a lot is the criminal backlog, which is very important, very pressing issue. The government partly created the problem through the lack of sitting days of recorders, and I hope that that's something Labour is going to continue to push about. You've already spoken about buildings being open up, and just reassure me that there's no way that Labour would ever support talk of speeding things up by abolishing juries, which I'm sure that we wouldn't. But I'm sure that that's not going to happen. But I just, as I say, you occasionally hear rumours in the press.
This isn't Northern Ireland, no.
Sarah Newens.
Hello. I'm a family solicitor, but actually I wanted to ask about what you said about legal aid, because I'm very concerned about young people coming into the profession. The rates that people are getting paid for legal aid and criminal legal aid is now appalling. And actually, I don't see how you can encourage young people to come into the profession when they are getting paid less than many other professions. And really, they've left with a load of student debt. They've had to borrow personally to pay their fees. And then solicitors and barristers, they can hardly make a living travelling to court. And then if we want quality representation, going forward, we need to get young people into the profession. And I think the problem is with the criminal profession at the moment is, I would also, those of us who are in our 60s, yes, we're carrying on working at it, but how are we going to invest into the future? And it's absolutely urgent we do something about this.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We're going to very quickly take Omar and then Darragh, but as quick as you can, please.
Hi, Omar Sye, I'm Vice Chair of the Society of Labour Lawyers. First, I just want to say that I was really pleased that you talked about advocacy. We held a meeting on kind of access to justice issues a few months ago, and one of the things that came out of that was the idea of looking at how we can work to put together communications that communicate around issues like legal aid and Human Rights Act and so on. So would be keen to work with you on that if that's something you'd be interested in being involved in. And then secondly, I'm the BAME officer for London Committee of Open Labour, and I think one of the things about on the diversity side is that if we want to be able to say that we're going to be able to reform judicial appointments or diversity in Parliament or anything else, we need to be able to show that we can do that within the Labour Party, and we've done that in some respects and made steps forwards. But I think that we need to do a lot more to embed good practice in the party, and I wonder if you support kind of measures, kind of a charter or something similar that kind of embedded good practice in terms of diversity in CLPs and socialist societies and so on.
Thank you very much, Omar. Darragh.
Hi, David. Thank you so much for your time speaking to us this afternoon. I'm Darragh Coffey, a barrister from 1 Crown Office Row. I'd be very interested to hear your views, if you would, on the Overseas Operations Service Personnel and Veterans Bill that I think is due for its second reading at some time soon. And indeed the separate legislation the government has signalled they want to introduce for Northern Ireland in this regard. Is this, in your view, something simply to appease the Johnny Mercers of the Tory party, but likely to have minimal effect and in fact might draw the sting from much of the criticism about the Human Rights Act? Or is this really a threat to accountability and a signal of the other erosions that may be coming down the track in this regard? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So 4 questions and closing comments, if we can squeeze it all in, David.
Well, thank you for mentioning the crime group. Yes, please, love to work with you down the line. And I hope some of the areas that I've indicated that I'm concerned about, I can draw on your expertise for. So that would be very helpful indeed. I too am concerned about our young lawyers and frankly why they would want to go into this area where there would be real issues about the ability to survive financially and flourish. And what it really means is that we're going to see a paucity of lawyers, really, not just in crime, but in areas that attract legal aid. And there will be issues around quality going forward as well. So I think that is a very serious issue. And it's why I indicated that we've got to scrap things like LASPO, get serious about bringing back a proper review mechanism on fees, and get things back onto a much surer footing. I mean, I have raised these issues with Robert Buckland, both publicly and privately, and my worry is it's not so much that he's not Chris Grayling, let's face it. However, where he sits within the Conservative Party, is he a big enough figure to actually make the change and make the and give the advocacy that's required? I'm just not sure. So that's the issue. Yes, I would support a charter. I think that the last period has been a really, really unsavoury period in the Labour Party on issues of diversity, for which I don't have to repeat. We have a review currently going on because some of the leaks and some of the awful things that were said, and I don't think I should get into now the issues around anti-Semitism. So this has been the lowest period I've seen in relation to these issues in our party, and we do need a reset. I would support a charter. I'm very happy to work with you on a way forward in that area as well. I'm afraid at the moment, next week, I have the divorce bill in Parliament. I also have the terrorism and sentencing bill in Parliament, and I have 4 SIs, one of which is on legal aid fees in the immigration area, which I'm about to pray against. So I'm not up to speed, I'm afraid, in that area, but I'm very happy, Darragh, if you want to sort of email me and give me your views, and I can look at it and come back to you in a slightly more informed way than I am at this moment.
It's been really fantastic to have the opportunity to speak at length with you, David. We really do appreciate your time, and thank you to everyone who has asked questions and made contributions as well. As I mentioned before, I anticipate that this is going to be the start of many more conversations on many areas, and we really look forward to supporting you, your team, and the Shadow Front Bench in every way that we can.
Thank you very, very much. But really appreciate it. You know, I really want to do all I can for our country, for our values in this area. I'm hugely excited to have the portfolio, and actually very excited about the prospects of actually getting into government. We've got a lot to do, obviously, still in the Labour Party, but I think we've got off to a good start, and I'm very, very excited to be part of the team. And, you know, I value this group of lawyers particularly, having been a member in the past. I have to rejoin, actually. I just haven't got around to filling in the forms. But thank you very much.
I hope everyone joins us next month, but thank you very much for joining us this evening. Good night.